An Ode to Becoming Human, a Europe remix. Audrey told Jimmy in the 80s that the American dream is a nightmare. While he's still believing and trying to reach for it, even if it meant that he needed to go tell it on the mountain. What though would Audrey say about Europa? They both had their separate love affairs with Europe, he more engulfed by the romance of Paris and the south of France. Audrey more the bonds she made with Black and folks of color, mostly lesbians in Amsterdam and primarily Berlin. Would Audrey call Europe a nightmare as well? Or would she see the sleeping beast that hides its insidious racism and its promise of progressiveness and ample social welfare? To make her verdict, would Audrey lean towards how Stuart, Claudia, and Linton were finding ways to break down the racist queen and the rest of Babylon, while supremacist police tried to burn down the mangrove? Or would she point to how sisters in Berlin during the 80s were being stomped by Nazi skinheads while their white allies mostly stood around helplessly, but they were always there to try and help clean the wounds in beds, sharing sometimes intimate spaces until Audrey told them to leave the room because she wanted to have community with her sisters of color and their jaws dropped? Would Audrey point to how Senegalese merchants near Montmartre were being denied full citizenship even as the country they lived in and their ancestors fought for in the Great War rants on about preserving laïcité? Some of them know that they had no problem burning that white heroin at the stake back in the days and have no problem denying full humanity to their glistening onyx Black bodies as the banlieue many are forced to live in are bursting at the seams. Could it be Sarah? And the fact that remains of her body were kept in that museum in Paris until Khoi people encouraged Mandiba to ask that white man to give her back, to return their ancestor back from the cold and exile to have a proper burial. Surely La Société will find another obsession, another body they will treat like a double-horned goat that they will gawk at when not scapegoating them for the ills of their land. Those blackened people who are sub, supra, and superhuman animal machine all at once. Would Audrey instead focus on Little Belgium to underscore the promise that will never be met for those with a darker hue in Europa? How at the turn of the 20th century, the pride of the lowlands was the zoos that expanded on what was done to Sarah and brought whole families to reside in cold stalls near the atomium, a future-thinking metal statue that would only reflect the height that this small land will go to show it can supremacists with the best of them. The arms that would mine the wealth for the greatest social welfare state create the wealth for businesses like Aber Congo Company, La Union Minière de Haute-Katanga that gave the Standard, BNP Paribas, and others life were still being cut off, and no one was counting yet by the time the zoos would be a reality. Zoos that gave families from Ostende a reason to make the trip to the center of the country, and those who lived near one of Dude's big castles on Leuven-Steenweg to take the tram to point and pull at Black skin. Audrey had hardly repeated herself, well, except when she wrote the cancer journals and then later wrote the book, A Burst of Light, on race, cancer, and injustices. So Audrey would surely not call Europe a nightmare. Not sure, but most likely she would reiterate how the construction of race had its foundation in Europe, specifically linked to the ugly characterization of different shaded Black bodies that were on display at the first auction of enslaved people in Lagos, Portugal, way after the Greeks gave Europa and formed what is falsely believed the foundation. It's Achilles' heel. Too bad Gatoi and Gan couldn't teach them about masculinity, reception, and how agency can only be exercised interdependently. Audrey, in writings and speeches, reminds Black women specifically to fill out what their futures would look like. Maybe this reminder is because her sharpened, sage-like insights, possibly only second to those of Octavia, would have surely seen that a country like Belgium, on a continent like Europe, that those in power and many in these societies would only create constructions that would give Black folks and folks of color access to the basic welfare they needed. Education, healthcare, and such things that would make European society seem better than those horridly and brutally racist Americans. While on the other hand, denying the possibility to be fully seen as worthy and full human. The theories and classifications developed by people like Linnaeus still dominate the way Europe sees its pureness and experiences its superiority. The racism, cultural and otherwise, the Islamophobia, the anti-Blackness is so monstrous in Europe that it is only in the last 10 or so years that Black people and folks of color have been allowed, in the eyes of the dominant culture, the possibility of becoming human. Rest assured that this is not because some white savior saw the light and switched on the Frankenstein-making switch. The process of being seen as full human within European society has been fought for by people like Philomena, who was pushed out of Holland to reside in LA. Many of Stuart's peers who were part of the Windrush generations that England has tried in recent years to send back to Jamaica. While in 2016 or so, Belgian lawmakers devised laws that would send second and third generation folks of migrant descent back to a motherland they never knew, if they dared to commit a petty crime or even be suspected of one. Truth is then, European society at large, especially if we are to believe that right-wing parties in places like Belgium, France, Holland, Italy, Switzerland, and others are not ready to fully rid of their anti-Blackness. Many in dominant societies see a Black skin, and they see two horns on each side of the head and fur coming down to the nose, wrapped around bloodshot eyes. In other words, the becoming human is not yet a project many in dominant Western European society are ready for. They are still grappling with the monstrosity they see when they see a Black skin. But as already alluded to countless times, Black folks and folks of color are not waiting passively to be saved. There are many doing the work, the activism and theorizing to assert the humanity that we embody. It is not an easy task. It is one that is a constant struggle, as Angela would assert, but it's also not insurmountable. That is why we need theory and deep thinking that Professor Zakiyyah Iman Jackson gives us. Such people, scholars, help us create a deepening of our foundation that we already have. Professor Jackson weaves together in a dense and rich multi-layered tapestry the theories of an Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, Sylvia Wynter, and others to provide us with new meaning and definitions that, if used and understood properly, it can carry us to new potentials. The future some of us see in Europa can only be shored up by incorporating such deep analysis of our shared oppressions. To be clear, this is not about imposing Black U.S. thought on the European context. Once again, to be clear, this is not about imposing Black U.S. thought on the European context, but it is more about encouraging the type of transatlantic exchange that Audrey, Jimmy, Sylvia, Angela, and many others embodied. Becoming human is a profound study that unearths and decodes while shedding new light on texts that derive from European thinkers and scientists who helped to mold the myth that we all find ourselves either embodying, confounded by, oppressed by, or all of the above. Professor Jackson also delves into the work of the Kenyan US-based artist Wangechi Mutu, adding a different layer of complexity that excavates the deep racism that helps us understand this moment. our moments, our pandemic realities that force us to examine, sometimes forcefully and painfully, the medical apartheid, to riff on Harriet Washington, that has fueled this current moment that sees indigenous folks of the Navajo Nation, Latinx folks living in Queens, New York, poverty-stricken Moroccans in Molenbeek, Black folks in the Matonge or in Memphis, feeling the burden and brunt of the inequitable access to medical care, not health care, that many people carry and face. Hello, everybody. My name is Tundé Adefioye. I'm a performing arts dramaturg and lecturer of U.S. popular Black visual culture at St. Lucas, Antwerp. A Nigerian American is based in Belgium. I've been here for over a decade now. So you've tuned in to the event on race, species, and becoming human, an evening with Professor Zakiyyah Iman Jackson. It's my honor to be hosting this event, an initiative from the Race and Research Network at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels to highlight the International Day Against Racism and a cooperation between VUB, Crosstalks, RIA, the Race Religion Constellation Project at Radboud Universiteit in the Netherlands, and Kai Theater. As such, it is part of an overarching series of events called More Than Human Encounters. I am pleased, humbled, and definitely privileged to virtually welcome Professor Jackson to our event. Professor Jackson is an associate professor. Professor Jackson just got her associate professorship today, if I'm not mistaken. Associate professor of English at the University of Southern California in the US, and author of the critically acclaimed groundbreaking book, Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World, published by NYU Press, in 2020. Professor Jackson challenges historical theories of humanist and post-humanist, but also reflects critically on African diasporic cultural production by reframing the construction of the human, anti-Blackness, and Black womanhoods. Quote, what emerges from this questioning is an unruly sense of being, knowing, feeling existence, one that necessarily disrupts the foundations of the current hegemonic mode of the human. Becoming human formulates a new axis of being without reaching for assimilation nor playing the signifying monkey. Professor Jackson's work is a lot to grapple with and should be required reading for all theorizing about race, society, feminism, and religion. Tonight, she will generously provide us with a 30-minute synthesis of the book in a talk titled Architectures of the Flesh. Thereafter, you have the chance to ask her questions for another 30 minutes. Please type your questions in the Zoom chat. You can already do so during her lecture. I will read them and pose them to Professor Jackson later. Professor Jackson, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that, Tunde, that offering and that really generous introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mariska and Justine, for convening this event. And I think I'm just gonna, and thank all of you for being here and watching. I think it's evening where you all are at. So thank you for spending your evening with me. So I'm just gonna jump in. I have 3 epigraphs. Is a metaphysics of race more or less serious than a naturalism or biologism of race? Jacques Derrida of Spirit. I felt the battle lines being drawn up in my own body. Audre Lorde, a burst of light. Sticks and bricks might break our bones, but words will most certainly kill us. Hortense Spillers, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book. It would appear that speculation regarding both the materiality and immateriality of genetic race has overshadowed the more fundamental and materially pertinent question of how racialized environments are embodied. Or as Clarence Gravely succinctly notes, quote, The common assertion that race is not biology may be correct in spirit, but it is too crude and imprecise to be effective. It does not adequately challenge the reductionism and genetic determinism of biomedical science or popular culture, and blinds us to the biological consequences of race and racism as sociocultural phenomena, end quote. In other words, the controversy surrounding the question of the reality of genetic race has forestalled a fuller recognition of the biopsychological consequences and somatic materialities of anti-Black racism. An exclusive focus on the domain of DNA undercuts what could be a fuller consideration of both the agentic capaciousness of somatic processes and the life and death stakes of that capacity. Sylvia Wynter would argue that this overinvestment in DNA is a symptom of biocentrism, a purely biological definition of what it means to be. Biocentrism is undergirded by a genomic principle that the human is a purely biologically determined mode of being. Biocentrism is characterized by Wynter as the belief that we are biological beings who then create culture. According to a biocentric logic, human cultural practices are linearly determined by groups' bio-ontological composition. Racism, Wynter argues, quote, is an effect of the biocentric conception of the human, end quote. She contrasts this belief system's reductive investment in DNA as substratum and mechanistic causation with an alternative. Quote, my proposal is that we are bioevolutionarily prepared by means of language to inscript and auto-institute ourselves in this or that modality of the human, always in adaptive response to the ecological as well as to the geopolitical circumstances in which we find ourselves, end quote. Wynter has expanded upon this view, which she calls the sociogenic principle, inspired by Frantz Fanon's famous axiom in Black Skin, White Mass, quote, besides phylogeny and ontogeny sans sociogeny, end quote, a transformation of Ernst Haeckel's theory of evolutionary recapitulation. Wynter's sociogenic principle draws on Fanon's observation that the individual ontogeny does not simply emerge and unfurl via species membership, phylogeny, in its natural scientific conception, but in dynamic relation to a social cultural situation, sociogeny. Fanon speaks of how the social situation, in this case, implicit knowledge of a historical racial schema, alters the psyche and the nervous system's biochemical dynamism prior to the reflectivity of consciousness. Sociogeny defines being, human being, in a manner that is not reducible to physical laws. In fact, said laws are redefinable as sociogenetic or nature culture laws because culture is not only what humans create, but also what creates human being. However, sociogeny differs from previous and contemporaneous theories of nature cultures that in that desire and affect play a decisive role in the concept. In contrast to a biocentric view of the species, Wynter argues, quote, we can experience ourselves as human only through the mediation of the processes of socialization affected by the invented techne, our cultural technology to which we give the name culture, end quote. Wynter once stated, quote, for me, Black studies is about enabling the exit from the substitute religion evolution, a substitute religion which represses the fact that once language has co-evolved with the brain, the process of evolution was followed by the event of human auto-institution, of autopoiesis, end quote. In other words, Wynter argues that the technology that is culture is evolutionarily significant, such that with the emergence of language, humans gain a technology that developed the power to direct the nervous system's order of perception and categorization, harness its drives to its now culturally defined sociogenetic own, and even override the genetic instinctual sense of self where necessary, activating by their semantic reprogramming the opioid system, the reward and punishment system, in culture specific terms as if it were instinct. Thus, semiosis plays a determinate role in the adaptive processes of both culture and biology, meaning and biochemical affect. Winter argues that racism deploys coercive semantic technologies and systemically impose roles that reify bodies into types or prescriptive categories, and these types and prescriptive categories in turn trigger affects, sensations, and behaviors reflexively, activated by pervasive associations that predefine and assign responsibility to those made representative of a type. Winter's sociogenic principle raises the stakes of our theorizations of representation by maintaining that representation is evolutionarily consequential and a primary determinant of the materialization of the organismic body's biochemistry of affect and desire. In this presentation, thinking with Winter's argument that this choreography has evolutionary significance and against a biocentric conception of the species, I want to push her theory of the sociogenic principle beyond an exclusive focus on the nervous system and problematize the auto of autopoiesis by reinscripting the embodied self as a kind of open work, produced by a lattice of agencies rather than a primarily self-authored closed system. I do this by centralizing the determinate materializing role not only of representation, but of referentiality itself. In other words, rather than assess the empirical truth claims of this or that representation of Blackened people, or calculate the distance between a sign and putative referent. So I'm not engaging in a question of positive or negative representation or accurate or inauthentic representation. I am more concerned with an epistemologically prior question. Under representationalism, what operations produce the assumption of reference? And what role does presupposition play in the materialization of flesh? I want to provide an analytic for interrogating what representationalism claims to do. I want to highlight the terror of representationalism and its politics, not of representation, but of materialization and dematerialization of the flesh. Representationalism's ontological propositions and effects commonly rely on a problematic material reductionism that I argue is secured by the idea of race in particular. In my book, Becoming Human, I examine how the demand that race be a material and visualizable fact of the body fueled empirical science and medicine writ large. I claim that representationalism is an imperialist racist rationale that drove a demand for a material basis of scientific evidence in general and was the engine of species designations in both humans and non-humans. The matter of racial being and its hieroglyphics of the flesh, to evoke Horton Spillers once again, have been the primary measure of being human and a principal site for maintaining and extending representationalist rationality. The presumed primacy and transparency of racial matter is called upon to adjudicate reality fact and truth in general and as such. In the process, non-representationalist systems of inquiry and modes of ontology are cast in the racialized terms of a teratology, whereby the so-called African fetish is its signal anxiety. Anti-Black metaphysics, as foreclosure, positions the existence of Black in reality beyond the conceptual borders of the dialectical encounter that underwrites representationalism's hegemonic processes of worlding. Moreover, representationalism's demand for visual evidence has historically been coincident with a limitless and insatiable appetite for the display and reification of the traumatized Black body. In other words, representationalism powers and acts as an alibi for state and mob violence, disfiguring anti-Black practices that attempt to engineer a Blackened body that conforms to its definition of Blackness as disaesthetic, the fleshly incarnation of a beauty, meaning a beauty as in not and without beauty, or the thing that doesn't look human. Ontologized plasticization is not interchangeability, replaceability, or exchangeability. It is not the conceptualization of how a good or asset is understood as being of equal value to another. If we consider the history of anti-Blackness, for instance, we might recall how a slave was commoditized alongside and made exchangeable with a cow or a horse. This familiar image is related to fungibility, our thinking on which is indebted to Saidiya Hartman's indispensable scenes of subjection. But ultimately, fungibility is not what I mean by ontologized plasticization. As a scholar engaged with the new materialisms, I am interested in what is called hylomorphism, or the form-matter distinction. Ontologized plasticization in my work is a conceptualization of form itself rather than a conceptualization of how a form is taken up within the logics of law, economic markets, or political economies. In other words, it is not a conception of the commodity and its uses. It is a conceptualization of property, but of the properties of form. Ontologized plasticization is not defined as the unnatural ordering of man and beast. It is a mode of transmogrification whereby the fleshly being of Blackness is experimented with as if it were infinitely malleable lexical and biological matter, a form where form shall not hold, such that Blackness is produced as human, subhuman, and superhuman at once. The at once here is important. It denotes immediacy and simultaneity. To put it another way, my concept of plasticity maintains that Blackened people are not so much dehumanized, cast as non-humans or as liminal humans, nor are Blackened people framed as animal-like or machine-like or simply exchangeable with these non-human forms. Rather, they are cast as sub, supra, and human simultaneously and in a manner that in a manner that puts being in peril because the operations of simultaneously being anything and no thing for a given order constructs Blackened humanity as the privation and exorbitance of form. The demand for willed privation and exorbitance that I describe does not take the structure of serialized demands for serialized states, but demands that Blackened humanity be all forms and no form simultaneously, human, animal, machine, and object. And, and, and. In other words, plasticization here is a mode of ontologizing, not at all deterred by the self-regulation of matter or its limits, nor by what Catherine Malibu has described as, quote, the fragile and finite mutability of finite and fragile mutability, in quote, of the form we call Black. Black studies scholars have often interpreted the predicament of Blackened being in relation to either liminality, movement from one state to another, or interstice, being in between states or partial states. What I am suggesting is that these appearances are undergirded by a demand that tends towards the fluidification of state or ontology. This demand for statelessness collapses a distinction between the virtual and the actual, abstract potential and situated possibility, whereby the abstraction of Blackness is enfleshed via an ongoing process of wresting form from matter, such that anti-Blackness's materialization is that of a dematerializing virtuality. We must think critically about the enthusiasm for ontological slippage in much recent posthumanist, eco-critical, and speculative realist critical theory, when that very imagination has been conditioned by what Penelope Deutscher, in a forthcoming form on my book, searingly and aptly describes as, quote, racial domination's drive to transform Blackness maximally into a resource for extraction within the limits of viability, end quote. And if by chance beyond viability, it typically incurs no consequences for the extractor. What is at stake is the definitive character or form, its determinacy or resistance, which is potentially fluidified by a willed excess of polymorphism and the violent estrangement of form from matter. Gendered and sexual imperial discourses on the Black female body provided the conditions of possibility for the historical emergence and administration of the generic construction of the human. The transcultural adoption of our current hegemonic and specifically biocentric conception of the human, as defined in the ontoteleological terms of natural science and philosophy, articulated Black female abjection in particular as a prerequisite of human qualification and the newly conceived globalizing terms that occasion the so-called age of discovery. Namely, I argue that Black female flesh persistently functions as the limit case of the human and is its matrix figure. This is largely explained that by the fact that historically the delineation between species has fundamentally hinged on the question of reproduction and the racialization of that function. In other words, the limit of the human has been determined by how the means and scene of birth are interpreted. This history's preoccupation with sexual difference and maternity is often evoked by a Latin phrase, partus sequitur ventrum, delivery follows the womb. I maintain that racism not only posits cleavages in womanhood, such that Black womanhood is made to be a gender apart, in other gender, but also that anti-Blackness itself is sexuating, whereby so-called biological sex is modulated by so-called culture, departing from an exclusive focus on structure, whether it be that of the double helix, or scaled up to the symbolic order. I argue that the matter of Black female sexuality and reproduction are better understood via a framework of emergence and within the context of iterative, interactive, multiscalar systems, biological, psychological, environmental, and cultural. To put a finer point on it, I propose that the matter of sex itself, the very biologic stuff of sexual difference, is imprinted, altered, and transmuted in dynamic relation to the anti-Black technologies of culture. In other words, at the registers of both sign and matter, anti-Blackness produces differential biocultural effects of gender and sex via what I am calling measurement. If, as Karen Barad suggests, measurement is a mode of knowing that is also a means of doing, making, or worlding, then I want to consider how the apparatus of measurement introduces its cause in parsing and ontologizing distinction. Barad clarifies, quote, measurements are agential practices, which are not simply revelatory, but performative. They help constitute and are a constitutive part of what is being measured, end quote. In other words, the means and modes of measuring are inseparable from the iterative material discursive phenomena they claim to identify. Measurement and mattering, metric and object are inextricable and co-constitutive, are to use Barat's terms, interactive within phenomena, not interactions. Quote, measurements are world making. Matter and meaning do not pre-exist, but rather are co-constituted via measurement interactions, end quote. Thus, it matters how something is measured. Take the case of the famous wave particle experiment. When electrons are light are measured using one kind of apparatus, they are waves. If they are measured in a complementary way, they are particles. As Barad explains, quote, what we're talking about here is not some object simply reacting differently to different probings, but being differently. What is at issue is the very nature of nature, end quote. Regarding bodily differentiation, sexual differences rather than sexual difference, what I suggest is that there is no pre-existing Black female body with determinate boundaries and properties that precede measurement. The organismic body is always making itself as it is being unmade in interaction with sociogenetic evolutionary histories, discursive material means of measurement. The organismic body's directedness, not unlike that of history itself, is marked by stable replication as well as chance and the aleatory. Thus, neither history nor the organism's effects can be known in advance. Measurement, including the logics of taxonomy and typology, as well as economies of desire and affect or affectivity, of raciality that accompany them, is sociogenically determinant of the materiality of sexual differences and reproduction. The logics of taxonomy and typology, the singularity of Black femaleness and the history of evolutionary thought is interactional with the matter we call the Black female body and the much discussed incomparable and confounding reproductive health indicators entangled with this material metaphor. Blackness, which is to say anti-Blackness, in this analysis is not a statistical variable, but an ecological force that administers and distributes capacities for health, well-being, and ability. And becoming human, I raise the question of how we might productively think with the non-human, including parts of ourselves such as bacteria that contest the logics of the body and sex difference as conceived by architects of biology such as Charles Darwin, Marion Sims, Ernst Haeckel, and Linnaeus. I would like to take this occasion to italicize a claim made in Becoming Human in a reading of Octavia Butler's Bloodchild. Bloodchild tells the coming of age story of a young man, Gan, faced with a difficult decision. He must decide whether he will incubate the eggs of an alien species or offer his sister in his place. This decision is especially vexing due to the entangled history of the two species. After fleeing from slavery and death on Earth, his people, Terrans, have found themselves on a planet populated by an insectoid people called Tilic. Initially, humans responded to the Tilic with hostility and mass murder. Despite direct conflict, the Tilic are now hosts for this hostile people, and they have established the preserve for human settlement. Both peoples have something to gain from accommodating the other. The humans, having escaped enslavement and genocide, have gained a new livable world, and the Tilic larvae grow stronger, larger, and more numerous when human bodies incubate their fertilized eggs. To complicate matters further, the Tilic who wants to impregnate Gan is Tigatau. She is both the top-ranking official who governs the preserve and a close friend of his mother, Lian, since childhood. Tigitau helped raise Gan and was herself incubated and born from the body of Gan's father. Butler challenges conventions of literary genre and those genre of the human predicated on racial slavery and colonial narratives of possessive individualism, sovereignty, and self-determination through a literary meditation on sexuality beyond heteronormativity, sexuation beyond dimorphism, and reproduction beyond the man-woman dyad, fabulating a species that bears resemblance to the family Ostridae, often referred to as a parasitic fly. Butler troubles a tradition of biological thought that sought to impose bourgeois patriarchal norms on nature and thus reify cultural projections via the authority of science and naturalize distorted perceptions as veridical. This tradition is perhaps most infamously illustrated by Linné's writings on botany. Not only was sexual dimorphism fraudulently imposed on the moreness of flowers' morphological difference during the 18th century, the period of botany's consolidation as a science, but also recourse to the idea or ideals of mammalian sex differentiation and heteronormativity made this ideal the privileged term in the taxonomical ordering of what exceeds its logic: flowers. For instance, in Linnaeus's highly influential Systema Naturae, 1735, he divided what he called the vegetable world into classes based on the number of relative proportions and position of stamens, which were understood as male. From there, he subdivided classes into orders based on the morphological characteristics, a number of so-called female pistils. Although he readily admitted the artfulness of his system and its metaphoricity was based on morphology rather than function, it nevertheless reinforced notions of natural hierarchical difference, since class stands above order in the taxonomical tree. We might choose to call the moreness that this history alludes hermaphroditism, but here I want to observe the caesura and aporia that attend what confounds vertical taxonomical thinking and resists assimilation into a pre-established notion of sexual difference. I want to underscore how the processes of differentiation we term speciation invite a reckoning with the limits and violence of our logics and orders of sex difference, both within man or the human and beyond the borders of that category. Departing from a heteronormative, anthropocentric mapping of the organism that I have just described, Tigitau's ovipositor vexes the imagination and invites the reader to reimagine the organ of sex, reproduction, and ejaculation. The ovipositor unsettles the morphological presuppositions of sex dimorphism and underscores that signifiers such as masculine and female, masculine and feminine, as well as female and male, are other than ontological pre-givens. Ostridae do not adhere to heteropatriarchal presuppositions of sexuated morphology and sexuality. Bloodchild unties reified notions of sex difference, sexuality, and reproduction in order to entangle them in an unfamiliar way in the narrative, a way that suggests sex difference is to evoke Ava Hayward's important work on transsexed womanhood, dispersion rather than binary. And I would add, even troubling the notion of sex difference as a continuum. Such an insight underscores that sex is superabundant with respect to reproduction. Moreover, in Bloodchild, reproduction is more than a biological imperative, but also encompasses superhuman evolutionary processes and a dynamic life history. Bloodchild breaches the term of Linnaeus's logic's tethering of sex, gender, and reproduction, challenging limiting and misleading notions of biological essentialism and determinism. Such logics have, of course, been primary to the poiesis of anti-Blackness that cast Blackened people as inverted or alternately excessive and deficient vis-a-vis gender and sex. Similarly, Gann's male pregnancy is not an exploration of the feminine position, but a feminized position, that of being subjected to the other. Gann is not feminine because he is a gestational parent, but rather because pregnancy is one of the more prominent symbols of what Denise Ferreira da Silva calls affectability and interdependence in a cultural context that equates interdependence, compromise, and accommodation with castration. And for that reason, these attributes have been feminized and or deemed unmanly. Like Tigitau, the figure of Gann does not map neatly onto gender stereotypes. Bloodchild encourages the reader to examine and challenge common assumptions of womanhood, including the equivalence of woman with female, feminine, biological reproduction, sexual reception, and motherhood through the introduction of a non-mimetic reflection or a recalcitrant analogy that emphasizes difference as much as, if not more than, similarity between terms. Here, Butler reveals that nature does not mirror human constructions, undercutting the solipsism that underwrites nature metaphors, such as those of Linnaeus. Thus, Bloodchild problematizes the solipsistic metaphorism it would appear to invite. The theme of male pregnancy provides an uncanny reflection that unsettles rather than stabilizes the andro-anthropocentric logic of nature analogies. Indeed, as Elizabeth Wilson notes, it is too reductive to transpose our subjectivities and identity categories onto the non-human. If we assume the non-human simply mimics human cultural and social forms, now routinely marked queer or trans, for instance, then we miss the possibility for nature to work on us, contrariwise, to render those familiar human, cultural, and social forms more curious as a result of their affiliation with so-called nature. Not as knowable through its association with familiar human forms, but because it renders the human, cultural, and social guises of queer less familiar and more captivated by natural and biological forces. To put it another way, an encounter with the non-human or with an ovipositor invites us not to ponder the assumed transparent difference of the strangeness of the human other, but to question the referentiality of our categories. In other words, to observe that opacity and differentiation is too often already falsely thought to be accounted for and understood via our categories. Imagining a new world, then, demands the reimagining of the body. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Jackson. That was a really rich reading, and I'm really glad that you, well, the part of the book that really spoke to me was the chapter on Bloodchild, especially what was being said about what you were saying about masculinities and this idea of the reception. And so I'm really glad that you also underscore this in your reading. There's a lot of questions, or a few questions from the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll skip the question I had for you and just start with what people had in the chat. All right. Okay. All right. So the first question is, so the individual said, thanks a lot for this event, Professor Jackson. In your book, you write that liberal humanism is fundamentally anti-Black. Could you elaborate on your understanding of liberal humanism?
That's a good question, and one it took me a whole book to answer. So I'm going to try. We'll see how I do. So if we think about liberal humanism as a conception of, let's say, man that comes out of the general upheaval of the Enlightenment, right? So the move towards the secular, right? The move towards the secular, the move to the idea of sovereign individual liberty, the move to understand the human as a biological category, the move to the move from feudalism to a class-based society. All of those moves inaugurated a particular conception of what it means to be. And that conception of what it means to be is a dramatic upheaval and transformation of what had existed before. And what I'm arguing is that that movement accompanied the age of discovery, or that movement accompanied the age of discovery, the rise of colonialism, the introduction of the global scale, and the transatlantic slave trade, right? And that moment and what the forms of an understanding of what it means to be human across, these various sites, those were developed in opposition to this idea of the Black, right? So they are defined against the Black. So the Black becomes this kind of self-canceling ground in order to erect this new sense of self, of the human, of democracy. And so those are kind of common sense ways of understanding what it means to be in law, in science, in the university. Those were produced in negative relation to Blackness, but even more than that, that Blackness gave form to these categories, right? Including the category of the human. So maybe that helps.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because I think you say it too that this idea of blackness actually erects sort of this understanding of whiteness and this kind of creation of the greatness that then that kind of colonizes the rest of the world.
So instead of thinking about whiteness as a thing that just exists and then there's like Black people who are other, I'm actually suggesting it's the other way around, that whiteness in Europe consolidates as an idea through this relationship to the native, and to the indigenous and to Blackness. And that happens through the historical introduction of the new terms of the global scale, right? And so there becomes this idea of the European, of whiteness, that is a reaction to or is an effect of the discovery of the Americas and the production of the Black.
Thank you for that. So the next question is sort of related to that. I think you kind of answered it, but I'll ask it anyways. Could you contrast the critique of liberal humanism for its anti-Blackness with other post-humanist critiques of humanism?
Okay. That's a good question. And I know I have written about that, but haven't really that much thought about it lately. So I will try. So in the paper I just presented, one of the things that I kind of took posthumanism to task for was a kind of romance with ontological slippage, right? And so there's this move to say, not say human, but say human animal, or to acknowledge continuities between humans and objects, are the ways that that human bodies are extended and dependent on technology. So the turn towards a prosthetic understanding of what it means to be. And, you know, none of those things are not true, but I think where, you know, what I want to underscore is that there's a kind of romance with this idea of letting go of a boundedness or a stable identity that is human, and letting go of a boundedness. But my argument is actually the predicament of Blackness is that of not being a bounded ontological entity. It's ontological slippage to the point of being a kind of formless form. And so in order for a structure, whether the structure is a psyche, as in the case of the first chapter, or an organismic body, as in the case of the last chapter in the coda of the book, in order for a form, even a form that transmutes, and of course all, you know, biological forms, psychic forms are mutable, and mutability is not the problem, right? It's not in that, you know, it's not in the mutability or the changing of the body. It's that change is demanded of the body in a way that's completely unhinged, such that that body, those kinds of competing demands of power, actually dematerialize that dematerialized form and leads to a certain kind of fluidification, which disaggregates form, right? And so, you know, I'm not, you know, this work is grounded in a conversation with evolutionary theory. So there's not a problem with mutability, but there is something about the way that mutability is demanded, infinite mutability, as if the Black can be any kind of form at will and on demand, right? At once, right? And so that is what the argument is there. And so it once we consider that, I think the kinds of arguments that posthumanism makes about this idea of giving up on, you know, human exceptionalism or human privileging or human centering, and being more open to ontological remapping or reconstitution, it reads a little unreflective about how the very human exceptionalism that they are talking about actually is only extended to some humans.
Wow, that was really rich. I'm already, I mean, I got to go back to the book. Of course, I'm thinking about what you were writing or what you noted about Donna Haraway, and also this idea of kind of plasticity that you talk about in the book. So the next question is, yeah, I would love to know more about this point you made quickly about troubling the notion of the continuum of sexual difference. Can you elaborate on the problems of understanding sexual difference as on a continuum, following Butler and Hayward?
Okay, great. Yeah, so so there's an idea that you have male and female, and that these are these polarized, I don't know, ends, right? There's a polarity there. And then people who are, say, intersex or trans get mapped as intermediary forms within the primacy of polarity. And what I am suggesting is that particular notion of continuum actually cannot really speak to or hold the complexity of sexual differences, plural, rather than sex difference, and that it cannot hold the variance of sexual differences that cannot be mapped in any kind of coherent way as a point between these two polarities, right? And so I think that the turn here for me is about superabundance and dispersion rather than mapping in between two pre-given poles.
Wow. I'm gonna need some time with that one, especially the part about the superabundance and the mapping that occurs actually of trans identities onto this reality. There are more questions. Someone said, you've noted that raciality's materialization is that of a dematerializing, well, quote unquote, virtuality. Could you please explain a bit more how you approach the term virtuality here? Thank you, and thanks for your fascinating work.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. Okay, so all right. So the idea is that, okay, so there is a demand for limitless forms, impossible, incompatible, simultaneous forms, right? So that demand asks that what is virtual become manifest and become possibility without attending to what Catherine Malibu talks about as the fragile and finite mutability of form. So if we think about, say, in an evolutionary context, okay, transmutation is always happening, right? Forms are always evolving, but you can't go from a piece of paper to a mushroom like that, right? The process of selection and mutation is not one of abracadabra, right? And so what I'm saying is that there is this attempt to work the boundary between the virtual and situated possibilities, right? Because what is possible is always situated. Everything that's potential is not always possible, right? And so that threshold is the site of where this kind of terror I'm describing happens, because it's again, it's not the transmutation is a problem, it's the terms through which transmutation is demanded.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out the different terms that transmutation is demanded. I'm going to go to the next question. How do you understand the difference between blackened people and blackness, especially in relation to Fred Moulton's criticism on Afro-pessimism for conflating the two?
Okay, well, I will tell you, I'm not super, I can't say that I am totally clear about the terms of that debate between Fred and Afro-pessimism. But but what I do know is that debate has moved a lot. And I'm not currently sure where it stands right now. But I will say that in terms of my own work, The reason I was interested in, or why I've been so insistent on talking about Blackened people, is because of what I emphasize in the paper, that my primary interest is in the politics of referentiality. So how we come to assume that that name should be or can be assigned to a particular materiality, and the politics of that before you even get to the question of realism, authenticity, positive or negative, the reality of the representation. I'm actually really interested in the mechanisms and operations of referentiality. And so I never want that question to disappear. And so the word blacken is always an attempt to remind the reader or the listener that Blackness is being put onto a materiality, right? That it is a verb, right? And that the work is never about Black people, right? As a kind of reified object. My work is on the process of the logics and ordering of anti-Blackness, and the process and logics of ordering Blackness as it relates to questions of referentiality, the problem space of referentiality and what that does. And so my insistence is on that. So, you know, the question of reification is actually the central question of the work. So I'm not assuming in any way a conflation between Blackness and Black people. My work is primarily about the relationship between those two.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that what you say about the Blackness is being put on is very critical. Is very crucial. That it takes different forms depending on the context and depending on this societal sort of reference points. So that's crucial. The next question is, so Sylvia Wynter wrote that professors are the grammarians of the social order, and that this comes with a responsibility. What do you think are the consequences of your research for the ethical responsibility of students of philosophy and the humanities more generally? Would you go as far as to say that the Blackness race connection should always be included in reflections on what it means to be human?
Well, okay, I'll take the second question first because that one's easy. Yes, I would say yes because the term doesn't have any coherence without Blackness, and I would say particularly without the projection of the African female subject of maternity and of reproduction. That's literally how the term coheres, right? Because species is primarily a question of reproduction, right? So the line of demarcation between one species and another species rests on the scene of the means and scene of birth, which is part of why the book stays with the question, as long as I do, of maternity and of reproduction and of reproductions and of different kinds of maternities, because that has been chosen to be the fetish of the idea of speciated differentiation. And so I would say yes. Now, in terms of the first part of that question, okay, I'm in here, I'm trying to remember where it is. It was about
Sylvia Wynter, I'll read it again. Sylvia Wynter wrote, no worries. Sylvia Wynter wrote that professors are the grammarians of the social order and that this comes with a responsibility. What do you think are the consequences of your research for the ethical responsibilities of students of philosophy and the humanities more generally?
The ethical responsibility. Okay, for me, the question of ethics, I'm with Derrida on this point, in that, we too easily think about the question of ethics as about our kindness to others, right? To
Mm,
others, like, how do we be kind to this or that other? Um, but the problem with that is we typically don't actually ask ourselves how we are being defined in that process, right? How are we defining ourself, the self of ethics, the self of relating to others? And so for me, the primary ethical question is the question of how do you define who you are? What do you presuppose about what it means to be you? And from there, you can figure out how you're going to relate to others. But, too often when we're looking at discourses of the humane, say in animal rights discourse, that conception of the human in that project is a fundamentally white, patriarchal notion of stewardship,
mm,
of white innocence, of the presumption of dominion, even if it's a kinder dominion.
mm,
And so, it's kind of theological, it's white supremacist, it's settler colonial baggage doesn't actually get examined, it actually gets reified or reintroduced in the scene of ethics, right? In the way that it props itself up as humane.
mm.
So for me, the question of ethics is fundamentally inseparable from the question of ontology.
Yeah, the questions of ethics, morality, and how it actually impacts the person and the individual and how it shapes you. I think that that's why reading Bloodchild through your writing is so kind of it gives form to this kind of understanding of how do we understand to this understanding of kindness to other and what we're doing for others. The next question is, first, I'm totally floored by your thinking. Your argument about what it means to become human seems to resist the human as the antidote to anti Blackness, so that the human is not the solution. Can you talk more about what it means instead not to disparage the non human and the animal versus calling for greater inclusion into the so called human?
I get that I get the part about the human not being the solution, which I will say correct. Um, but let me see, can you say more about what it means instead not to disparage the non-human? Okay, okay, okay. Okay. I think I understand. Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's take the first part. Um, so in terms of the human not being the solution, you are right, not being the solution. This is not a call for inclusion or correction to dehumanization by humanizing Blackened people. Because what I argue in the book and what I examine in the book is actually not the violence of dehumanization. I certainly would never argue that no one has ever said that Black people are not human. What I will say is that what I examine in the book is the terror of the process of turning Black people into humans and the violence that happens at that site. And what I also examine in the book is the violence of humanization, um, Oh, and how thinking with the work of Saidiya Hartman and Scenes of Subjection, one of the things that she says that I think is so often missed in that book is that, you know, that book is about or examines moments, scenes where humanity is recognized, the slave is recognized, the heart, the mind, the body, um, familial attachments, filiation, that those things that are seen as the unique endowments of what it means to be human actually become the entry points to terror, not the denial of those things, but the manipulation of those things, the taking advantage and exploitation of those things. And so, so much of what we think of as racism's dehumanization is actually the violent terms of incorporation into this universal idea of humanity, into a universal idea of humanity that is racially hierarchical. And so in that context, it is an attempt to disenchant us from the idea that if we were seen as human, if only we were included, if only we were recognized, that that would be somehow an antidote to this problem. It's actually, more complex than that, in that what happens, and the book is about this, when recognition of humanity happens at the register of biology, at the register of the subject of law, at these different registers, at the ethical register, and that actually becomes the inroads to produce this kind of plasticization that I'm describing. So what I suggest in the book is the cultural texts I look at, the visual and literary artistic practices. What they suggest is opening up the question of ontology, or what it means to be. And what's on the other side of that, I don't think is the human at all. That they renew and raise the visibility of the question of what it means to be in a way that is non-self-identical to any common sense, jurisprudential understanding of what it means to be a human at present. And so they raise in the profile of the question of ontology, highlight it, underscore it, raise its status, rather than offer pleas or bids for inclusion.
Mhm. Yeah. How are you doing?
Good.
All right, cool. Just wanted to check in because there's a lot coming in. How are we doing with time? All right, cool. So we still have time for maybe two more questions. Um, yeah. So the next question says that for Kyla Schuler, plasticity is 19th century's white citizens' monopoly of self-betterment and realization. But for you, ontological plasticization is a kind of epistemological violence imposed on the Black body.
Okay, great. Yeah, Kyla's work is super important, and there's a number of us who have converged on this language of plasticity. Um, for me, plasticity came out of reading Scenes of Subjection and the use of the word plastic in Scenes of Subjection. And the years that followed, Catherine Malabou's concept gained visibility. Kyla Schuler has done important work. But I guess I would say that what I'm arguing, and I address this in the book in terms of Schuler's important work, that I think our work is really complementary, but that the kind of betterment and optimization that Schuler is talking about is conditioned by a racial imaginary that is fundamentally anti-Black. So the kind of eugenic promise that Schuler talks about, or that we find in discourses, ableist discourses on autism, right? So plasticity is heralded as like some kind of a solution to, say, autism, or that we can figure out the mechanisms that make, a person trans, and we can correct them, right? Because we're plastic, right? That kind of imagination is predicated on a shadow history of experiments on enslaved personhood, right? This idea of like exploring the limits and even beyond the limits of what you can do to a biological body, is absolutely indebted to the scientific experimentation and the social experimentation of enslaved personhood. And so the two are actually related to each other. The fantasy of optimization is an anti-Black fantasy.
Mm. Which has implications for how people receive medical and healthcare today, how Black people receive medical and healthcare. I mean, you talk a lot about maternity. I mean, the most famous case is someone like Serena Williams, who, her pain is discredited because she is a Black woman. So how could she have that much pain? Thank you for that. So this is the last, well, it's two kind of small questions. I'll co-join them together. So the first one is, could you say a few words about your writing and thinking process? And then the longer question, at the end of the chapter, Not Our Own, after you meticulously break down and explore the symbiotic significance of receiving, among other principles, in Octavia Butler's Bloodchild, you conclude, quote, such a praxis might very well leave the human behind. Imagining a new world then demands the reimagining of the human body. After reading that, I could only think we need more of this type of writing, this type of explorations. So do you have a new book in the works? And what, can this reimagined look like?
So writing process. Let me try to say something about my writing process. That's a really interesting question. What is my writing process? I mean, these days it feels like, whenever I can get in to write, because, being on the other side of graduate school, I just feel like my time to write just shrinks and shrinks. Let me see, what can I say about that? I read a lot of poetry. I listen to a lot of music. And, I write to try to say what it is I need to say. And I try not so much to think about audience, because when I start thinking about audience, I worry then I will have those voices in my head. And, I try to push myself to work in ways that are profoundly uncomfortable. And then I figure out how to engage an audience later. But I try to initially get the ideas out, even if they're unsettling. So like the chapter I shared some of on Octavia Butler, I was just like, the whole time I was writing it, I was just like, oh my gosh, like this is really uncomfortable stuff. So I would say that. But in terms of what I'm working on, so currently I'm at work on a second book, tentatively titled Obscure Light, Blackness and the Derangement of Sex Gender. It argues that anti-Blackness constitutes the bedrock of modern Western logics of sex gender, and meditates on how its terrorizing vertical orders might be toppled by the transfiguring potentialities of Blackness. Ultimately, the project provides a critique of biocentrism, our biological reductionism and determinism, and elucidates the indistinction of gender and race, what I'm calling the indistinction of gender and race. So that's the project I'm working on now.
I can't wait. I can't wait. Wow. When do you think that might be coming out? No pressure. No pressure.
One can hope, like, a couple of years.
Yeah.
We'll see.
All right, all right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And also thank you for everyone for your contributions and your great questions. And of course, to the organizers of tonight's conversation and the technical staff behind the scene. Yeah, just for your time and kind of your patience with all this process and your insights. And for the audience, you should know that tonight's event is part of the overarching More Than Human Encounters series organized by VUB Crosstalks and Kai Theater. So stay tuned for the second series of More Than Human Encounters next season. That's October, November 2021 and March, April 2022. It'll be a mix of live and online events. So to stay connected, so definitely register at www.crosstalks.net. Thank you so much. Thank you once again. And love your background. Make me feel at home. And yeah, so wishing all of you a peaceful evening and please take good care of yourself and be well. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.